Looking at this episode in hindsight, this feels like an episode that should be worse than it is. But on this reviewing, even with analysis mode on, I still found myself enjoying it more than I thought I would. Now, I do have to add, on top of that, the fact that it is in many ways a very typical episode. In fact, I would say this is actually completely average in terms of its plot. But its framework and several other things they do with regards to the directing and the approach to it actually help to elevate it in several ways. If you don't understand what I mean by that, let me to elaborate a little bit. Let's say the episode, let's say the children's story section with the Borg children didn't happen at all, right? So that was absent from the plot. And instead of beginning basically at the end of the story, it began at the beginning when he started reciting everything when they were going to that first nebula. So if that had been the episode, I would just be like, ugh, on this whole thing. Instead, they do several things that help to elevate it. That was odd. Including accidentally hitting a button on my keyboard. It's one of the problems with not having a huge desk. I don't have many places to put my notes here. Let me just try scooching this to this side. There we go. So, this episode does do things very well, even though it's using a completely average plot. In fact, I'm pretty sure we've already seen the alien, nebula-like energy being accidentally ends up in the ship and ends up kind of encouraging the ship to do something and the communication thing. I'm pretty sure we've seen that on TNG. I don't actually remember a specific episode, though. I'm also pretty sure we've seen something pretty similar to that in Voyager, too, but I digress. It's a very average concept. But they do several good things right. I've already kind of hinted at several of them. First of all, they have the framing device. The framing device of Neelix telling the story to the kids. Now, let me go ahead and give some praise to the kid actors in this one. Granted, Icheb is actually not that young. He's just made up to be young. But the other three do a decent job, and they overall come across as the right mix of what's needed for the scenes. Being, on the one hand, they're clearly not normal human children. They do say and act in several ways that indicates their alien nature, which is good. And I do like the idea of a Borg looking at a horror story as a puzzle to solve. I like that concept. Because I imagine the concept of horror doesn't really apply in the standard way to a Borg. Instead, they just see something, something to determine and then to produce some kind of result against, right? But so they do a good job with that. So the framing device helps, and of course, I do like Ethan Phillips. I know a lot of people hate Neelix, and I don't care because I think he's actually a good actor, and he does a good job of actually feeling like an individual who is not a horrible person in this episode. He comes across as fairly human, for lack of a better term. And fairly fragile, actually, as well. But then the next thing they do very well in this episode is they start in medias res. In other words, like I mentioned earlier, the episode actually starts at the end of the story. And then we find out what's happening while the children find out what's happening. Now, before I go further, let me say that I've heard several Star Trek fans debate whether this actually happened or not. Or, to be more accurate, debate how much of what Neelix relates is true. Not that I've never heard anyone who thinks Neelix is outright lying, because the overall assumption that I've heard most people say is that the events as Neelix retold them did actually happen. And as always, I would like to hear your guys' feedback on this as well. I love to hear from other Star Trek fans, but the how much of it was. There's an episode in TNG, I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's a matter of perspective episode, where we see the same events from Riker's perspective and the alien's perspective, and I think a third person's perspective. It's been a while since I've seen the episode. It's a great episode. And the key point in that episode is no one was lying. Okay, no one was, well, that's actually not true. Wait, no, that is true. No one was lying involved in it. No one was actively trying to deceive. It was just different people were showing things as they perceived them, right? So in other words, even if Neelix is telling the truth, it is the truth as he perceived it, and this is not the absolute truth. Makes sense? Moving on. There's a type of writing where the characters know what's going on far before the the viewers do. And it's hard to do that kind of writing correctly because you have to basically dance around dialogue in order to not show... a character basically has to bite their tongue or see something in a slightly unusual way to not just give away information that the viewer doesn't have. But it is a nice way to maintain suspense for the viewer. It's kind of the opposite of the Columbo style of writing, which is where the characters know nothing and the audience knows exactly what's going on. But we'll talk about that when it's actually relevant. There's a TNG episode in particular that comes to mind for that one. And finally, there's sort of a Lower Decks vibe to this episode. I wanted to talk about that a little bit as well. It's not actually a Lower Decks concept, and yet at the same time it kind of is. The majority of the focus of the episode, as I said, is primarily focused on Janeway, and a little bit on Tuvok, and a little bit on Chakotay, and a little bit on Seven. Fairly normal, right? But the additive to that is Neelix. Now, Neelix is, well, arguably a main character. I mean, he's one of the people who actually gets to go to the officers' meetings, for example, and he qualifies as bridge crew in the actual structure of the ship. But he is still in many ways a lower deck character. He's not involved in every single little detail going on in the ship, and the whole concept of Neelix being stuck in sickbay, or not, excuse me, sickbay, stuck in the mess hall, no idea what's going on, no idea how things are unfolding, that gives that sort of, what does it feel like? What does the crisis of the week feel like to the people who are not in charge, who are not on the bridge? And there's several sequences in this episode that do that. We get that from the kids in the framing device, we get that from Neelix in the mess hall, and we get that from Celis and Harry as they're roaming the ship. And all three of these scenes are actually pretty good. As an aside, I really liked the recurring element of the Bajoran woman Celis coming back here, because A, I think she's a good actress, and I think her character is actually interesting as opposed to, bland or boring or whatever. But B, and more importantly, I think that her interactions with Harry were really good. Harry actually takes command, as an officer should. He is an officer, remember, despite his rank. And he does so twice in this episode. Once on the mess hall, right at the beginning, and once when he encounters her and when he's like, we need to get to engineering. Both of those show the Harry Kim that should be, and the one that has, at least hypothetically, developed from previous seasons. Granted, Harry Kim doesn't get a lot of screen time in the next, well, I guess, season. We're almost at the end of season 6, aren't we? Anyways, but they did do these things right. So in other words, this is a bad example, but if you were to consider a hamburger from, I don't know, like Burger King or whatever, to be average food. I know that's a weird thing. Most people would probably say a burger from a fast food joint is bad food, but presume for a moment with me, just work with me. Like picture a dish that you consider to be an average dish. It's not great, it's not terrible, it's just something you eat on a normal basis. And imagine someone has dolled it up and they've really made it nice, and there's this nice accoutrement, and there's a good wine and or soda and or Canada Dry going along with it, something that helps to really make the meal much better than it otherwise would be. That is how this episode feels to me. Average plot. Completely average, just completely straight line, boring, but well garnished and well designed. But I want to talk about that Lower Decks concept a little bit, because I was asked a question the last time it came up. Why do I like the Lower Decks concept so much? I thought about that for a bit, and I came up with 2 reasons. First of all, it's not something they do all that often. In fact, off the top of my head, I think they've only really done the Lower Decks concept across Star Trek twice. Really done it. Once is, of course, the Lower Decks, which is where I get the term from in TNG, and the other is the Good Shepherd in Voyager, which is about halfway. I'm sure there's probably others I just can't think of right now, so it's not exactly a common thing for them to do. I think now that I think about it, there's a DS9 episode that does that as well. It's one that's centered around Jake and Nog, I'm almost positive, who effectively function as the Lower Decks of DS9 because they're not involved in the crisis of the week. Anyways, so it's not something that's done very often, so it's some good variety, okay? The second reason I like it is because it presents some interesting story ideas for me. It means you have to write the whole story, what's actually happening, and then you have to adjust yourself. You basically have to write a second story attached to that one saying, okay, now that we know what's actually happening, what is this tiny little dot's viewpoint of what's happening? And there's always been something fascinating to me about that, but in addition, it does one other thing that literally just occurred to me just now that really helps flesh that out. So it's a nice way of creative writing, and and I think this is more important now that I'm thinking about it, it's personal. I've always been a big fan of personal storytelling. I mean, it's one of the reasons Mass Effect 2 is a better game than Mass Effect 1, in my opinion, because it's much more focused on the individuals, on the characters. It's much more character-centric. And it brings me back to that Morden quote from Mass Effect 2. I mean, yeah, saving the galaxy is nice and all, but you can't really envision that. You can't picture the galaxy. You picture your favorite nephew. Lower Decks episodes brings it down to the favorite nephew. It makes you care about this tiny individual character and actually want to know more about them and want them to, things to work out for them. One of the most tragic things of the Lower Decks over in TNG was things didn't work out for her. She died. That was horrible. And it wouldn't have had impact if it hadn't had that personal feel to it. Makes sense? Now, I wrote a quote here. Snacks are irrelevant. I don't have anything else done. Like I said, I think the kids do a good job. I don't have much else to flesh out on that. I mean, they say several things. The approach of haunting style is a puzzle to be solved. Snacks are irrelevant. And the fact that they are still kids, even if they are alien kids, it's well done. I don't have much else to add to that. I also like how Majel Barrett is basically the villain of this episode, for the second time in Star Trek history. The first time, of course, being Loxana Troi. Okay, I know, that's actually I'm joking, but I know that a lot of people really don't like Loxana Troi. Not Majel Barrett. In fact, I've never heard anyone who actually has, rancor or anger towards Majel Barrett. Most people agree she was an awesome person and an awesome presence and, blah, 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 blah. Loxana Troi, on the other hand, that's a little more contentious. But I don't have much else to add to that. It was just something that struck me as very funny as I was watching the episode. There's a lot of good scenes in this episode, but ultimately I don't have much to say about them. They're very average. But a lot of scenes are shot very well, and they do some things that are unique in this episode. Showing the ship go to warp from the perspective of the captain's chair as Tom is turned around. The view from inside a replicator. The unusual angles as certain things are moving through the ship. The way the framing was on whenever the turbolift doors would shut unexpectedly. It's very well directed, and I found myself just praising the directing. I have a note here saying, excellent directing, and then I bothered to look up who the director was, and of course it's David Livingston. Now, I hope you've been watching this series, my series, the Rumination series, long enough to recognize that name. But if you don't, he's a great Star Trek director. There are a lot of amazing Star Trek episodes that have been under his belt. So it's no surprise that he was able to take this and say, yeah, and again, add to that presentation value I mentioned earlier for an otherwise average episode. There's a lot of genuine atmosphere and tension in an episode that really shouldn't have any. I mean, this episode is the definition of a pat ending. The climax happens like a minute and a half, I want to say, or maybe it's 2 minutes. It's very, very short, very, very soon to the end of the episode. It's like, I want command of the ship back. And then she gets it, the end. I mean, that is the definition of a pat ending. But the overall build-up to that point is really well done. It makes me wonder what they could have done if this had been a good plot underneath it instead of just an average one. This right here, this is the kind of thing I would love to do a script doctor work on. Just take it and say, all right, let's make something out of this, One last note, only one more note on my notes here. I did like Icheb's presence in the episode, even though some people I know think it's a little bit mean-spirited. I don't think it is. I think it's just poking good fun. If you don't know what I mean, Icheb is your stereotypical Star Trek nerd in this episode, constantly poking holes in technical difficulties and certain aspects of the story that are incorrect, but only in a nitpicky kind of a way. And he does that several times throughout the course of the episode. That's all I got. Decent episode. Which is good. It's kind of an inoculation thing, or I guess the opposite of inoculation. Because the next episode is Unimatrix Zero. Ugh. I'll see you next time, guys.